It's the last paper of today, and it's a paper by Corina Mieth, who is a full professor for practical philosophy at Ruhr University in Bochum. For many years, she has also worked with Ottfried Höffe, to whom you could listen yesterday night. And today she will speak about Kant's cosmopolitanism. I find it very fascinating that Kant, who has never left Königsberg, has developed one of the most outstanding cosmopolitan philosophical systems. And it seems to me that to become a real cosmopolitan, you just have to be a genius and read books. So, the word is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And as you already mentioned, my talk is about Kant's cosmopolitanism and the right not to be treated with hostility, which was already mentioned by Roberta this morning. And I just remind you of some passages I highlighted in the third definitive article from Towards Perpetual Peace. And that is that cosmopolitan right refers to the right of a stranger not to be treated in a hostile manner by another upon his arrival on the other's territory. So Kant goes on saying, if it can be done without causing his death, the stranger can be turned away, yet as long as the stranger behaves peacefully where he happens to be, his host may not treat him with hostility. And then he goes on, I also highlighted that, so that people do not have the right to be a guest, but they have a claim to present themselves to society by virtue of the right of common possession of the surface of the earth. And then Kant highlights that originally no one has more of a right to be at a given place on the earth than anyone else. So just to remind you of these passages of the third definitive article of Towards Perpetual Peace. So there has been a lot of interpretations of this passage. I just mentioned three approaches. So one is ethical, and a lot of people were referring to universal hospitality as a virtue of cosmopolitan citizenship. And then there is a historical interpretation, which on the one hand points out what this means for innkeepers, because then when foreigners came into the land of others, they stayed somewhere at innkeepers, and innkeepers, for example, had the duty not to rob them or to harm them in any other manner. So as long as they behaved peaceably, they had the same rights and the same protection that citizens had. And also another historical interpretation, that's in the context of Kant's anti-colonialism. So we have to be aware of the fact that at the time when Kant was writing Towards Perpetual Peace, so migration was happening into the other direction. And then Kant was saying, and that was already quoted this morning too, that the Europeans took the Native Americans for nothing, and he criticized that in Towards Perpetual Peace. So then we can understand, and some interpreters already did that, the right not to be treated with hostility in the sense that it's on the condition that you behave peaceably. So that's also a historical dimension. And then there's a legal dimension to interpretation. And here, a lot of contemporary scholars try to derive a lot of rights from this passage. For example, the right to asylum, or the right to access to Western countries, the right to citizenships, and other rights for people who want to immigrate to Western countries today. Now, my aim in this presentation is to understand better what it means in a legal and ethical way to not be treated with hostility. So that's my focus. Okay. So, and this is the structure of the talk. In the first part, I ask what it means to treat someone with hostility. I point out 3 dimensions of hostility, and then I describe hostility as wrongdoing beyond instrumentalization. And in the second part, I will point out some institutional dimensions of wrongdoing regarding migration and give 3 examples of hostility against immigrants, and then evaluate the examples. That's the program, and then I will draw a conclusion. Okay, so let's start with 3 dimensions of hostility. It's just to categorize hostility. It's from the Oxford Dictionary. So first, there are hostile feelings and attitudes towards other persons. So here, hostility means feelings of hostility toward people from other backgrounds. Examples would be what we call in German Fremdenfeindlichkeit or gruppenbezogene Menschenfeindlichkeit, then in English xenophobia, or in French xenophobie. And that would point out so that people are afraid. Phobos means fear in Old Greek, of foreigners, and that seems to be wrong. Then there can be hostile attitudes based on rejection of ideas, and that could possibly be justified by reasons. So hostility towards something in the sense of a strong and angry opposition toward an idea, a plan, or a situation. For example, nuclear power plants. So my colleague Klaus Steigleder at Bochum, who is also a Kant scholar, but then now he engaged in environmental ethics, and he holds that Germany should keep the nuclear power plants running. And then he gets strong, angry opposition from a lot of students. And that doesn't refer to him as a person, but to the idea he puts forward. So, and that, of course, can be justified depending on how good your arguments are. And then hostility can be used as a technical term, so referring to hostilities as acts of fighting in a war. That can refer to the start, outbreak of hostilities between the 2 sides, or a cessation of hostilities, the end of fighting. And that can also sometimes be justified. Namely, Kant himself, and I can also here refer to a talk that has been given at this conference before, because Kant, of course, has a theory of just war. So then, in the natural condition, he says, of states the right to war, to hostilities, is the permitted way by which a state pursues its rights against other states, namely by its own force, when it believes itself injured. And we heard that before, so the theory of just war that Kant puts forward in Towards Perpetual Peace is a theory of self-defense. So once you're attacked, then you're allowed to defend yourself, and of course, by force, by violence. And that is legitimate hostility. Okay. But then, Kant also refers to hostility in the sense of A, and he doesn't do that in Towards Perpetual Peace, but he does that in the religion. And here he disqualifies hostility as a vice. I quote, "This self-love creates the inclination to become worthy in the opinion of others. This starts as a desire merely for equality, to allow no one to rise above oneself, combined with a constant anxiety about whether others are trying to do just that, from which there gradually arises the unjustifiable craving to achieve superiority for oneself over others. Great vices can be grafted into this twin stem of jealousy and rivalry, namely the vices of secret and open hostility towards everyone we see as alien to us. So, in ethical sense, we have the disqualification of hostility, and then in a legal sense, as we've seen before in Towards Perpetual Peace, Kant has a theory of just war, so that if you are attacked, you're, of course, allowed to be hostile and defend yourself. Therefore, I think there is a tension between the idea that treating someone with hostility is always morally wrong, and the idea that, for example, soldiers of the other hostile part in warfare, so enemies, can be treated with hostility. Kant himself implies in the quote from Towards Perpetual Peace that hostility can be adequate if foreigners do not come in peace. So, of course, the Ukrainians, from Kantian standpoint, can defend themselves against the Russian invasion and consider them as enemies. So now my question is, what kind of wrong does hostility constitute in the Kantian system, and when is it adequate? And here I want to look into Kant's ethical system, because there seems to be a problem with hostility there. And I go from the groundwork and from the formula of humanity from the categorical imperative, which says, so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. So the mere thing that this formula requires seems to be to treat others as ends in themselves. So one could also say to treat them as persons or respect their dignity. And now it seems like if you ask what does it mean not to treat others as ends in themselves, that the answer would be to treat them as mere means. So therefore, instrumentalization is prohibited in the formula, so never merely as means. But, so not treating others as mere means does not necessarily amount to treating them as ends in themselves. There are other forms of severe wrongdoing. So that's where I want to point your attention to at the moment. Namely, others can be wronged even if they are not treated as mere means, namely if they are not treated as persons but as things. So if I treat someone or respect someone as a person, then the other one is the, as Kant writes in the groundwork, supreme limiting condition of my ends. And that's opposed to a thing, because a thing has only relative value depending on whether it's useful or irrelevant or useless to me. So persons have absolute value independent of whether they're useful or useless to me, whereas things have only relative value depending on whether I judge them as useful or not. So, and therefore, there are several kinds of wrongdoing connected to treating or regarding others as things. And one of them, but only one of them, is treating them as mere means. So if we then consider them as useful to us. But we can also treating others as irrelevant, so they don't matter to us. And one example would be Singer's drowning child in the shallow pond. So if you just walk by and let a child drown, you're not using it as a mere means to your ends, but you're treating it as simply irrelevant, as if it didn't matter. And that would also be incompatible with treating it as an end in himself or as a person, but it's a different kind of wrongdoing than treating someone as a mere means. And then we can also fail to treat others as persons or as ends in themselves by treating them as mere obstacles. And there is a difference between a mere means, which is useful to me, and a mere obstacle, which is not useful to me, but in my way. So the means I want to use, the obstacle I want to get rid of. And it's very interesting that Kant himself didn't point out this category to treating others as mere obstacles, because I think if we look into the history, then a lot of mistreatment of others would fall into that category. So there are already people there where you want to go, and you don't want them there because you want to settle down there, and then they're not means to you, they're obstacles to you, and you want to remove them and get them out of your way. So, insofar, there are other kinds of wrongdoing than instrumentalization. And then there is still one kind of wrongdoing that the distinction between person and thing doesn't capture, and that's persons can also be wronged by being treated as negative ends. I've worked that out in a paper together with Jacob Rosenthal, and that has to do with the last talk, so with evil, because a negative end would be something that I want to destroy. And so that is only a person mattering in themselves, but as a kind of negative end, not a positive end, harming, hurting, humiliating other persons as purpose of my actions. Malice, hate, revenge, or sadism would be example for that. And that would be evil. But that would refer to treating others as persons in a negative way and not as things. And that can even amount to, then, think of Schopenhauer's three categories. So he has egoism, altruism, and malice. So a separate category for malice. And then he says, well, if you want to harm others as the purpose of your action, that can even sometimes happen at the expense of like raising really high costs to yourself. And therefore, it's distinct from egoism. Okay, but it's an interesting discussion, so whether Kant knows evil or not, and how can we describe it in a Kantian framework. Okay, so I distinguish three kinds of practical attitudes: treating or regarding others as ends in themselves or positive ends, respecting their dignity as persons. Second, treating or regarding others as things, which means ascribing them only relative worth according to my ends, judging them as useful, irrelevant, or useless, or obstacles in my way, and then treating or regarding them as negative ends, so with malice trying to destroy them as persons. Now, hostility and practical attitudes. I think that hostility in the sense of a hostile attitude towards a person is wrong if incompatible with treating her as an end in herself. Hostility in the sense of rejection of ideas or fight against enemies seems justifiable in the Kantian system. So the right not to be treated with hostility also stands under the condition of peaceful behavior. What can we make out of that? So it seems that in the case of an invasion into one's country, hostility in the form of killing enemies is perfectly justified. It's a just war if you have been attacked. But wouldn't that mean not to treat others as ends in themselves, to disrespect their dignity? I mean, how can we do that at the same time? To respect them as persons and to kill them? It seems that hostility is justified if one does not treat the other party as mere enemies. So that's what my colleague Martin Sticker from Bristol, with whom I work a lot, pointed out in his recent paper, that you can mistreat someone as a mere means, whereas it's totally okay to treat them as a means. So if they agree or consent to the treatment, for example, which make the difference between means and mere means. And so analogous, you can treat people as enemies. So if they're part of an invasion to your country, but not as mere enemies, so you can't reduce them to the status of an enemy. So, and mere enemy would then mean to deprive the person of her equal moral status and her basic human rights, whereas enemy would mean then to treat them as part of the hostile army, but then within the realm and the limits of the Geneva Convention, human rights, and the law of warfare. And that would lead to a criticism of ideas like enemy combat law, Feindstrafrecht, which ascribe a lesser moral and legal status to persons that are seen as enemies of society. But they're still then enemies and not mere enemies, because mere enemies would mean that they have no legal status left, that they are deprived of any legal status. So this would be in between. And of course, to treat as an enemy in a legal sense in the Kantian system would require so that they did not come in peace, which makes the self-defense legitimate, and then they have to be treated within the realm of law, which is applied to them equally. And then it's compatible to treat someone as an enemy and as an end in themselves at the same time. So that would be the proposal. Okay, let's draw an intermediate result. Treating someone with hostility in the sense of A is not compatible with treating someone as an end in herself in the Kantian system. Hostility in this sense could be understood as a form of treating others as negative ends. But Kant also uses hostility in the sense of C, the technical term, so that hostility can be justified towards someone who does not behave peacefully. He may then be treated as an enemy, but not as a mere enemy, and not according to Feindstrafrecht, because then he wouldn't be treated as an equal person, but as a lesser person within the category of enemy. Okay. Second part. Oh yeah, I'm doing fine. Okay, so hostility towards migrants. Here I bring 3 examples. The first one is Theresa May. Her aim was, as she stated herself, to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal migration. The second one is Emmanuel Macron. Let's just sum up. So it's about people with migration background who are already in the country, who live in the Paris suburbs, and he says, well, look, we have nothing better to offer to you than a job which requires from you to work 60 to 70 hours per week in order to get the minimum wage, but this is better for you than to hang around and sell drugs. This will give you dignity, Uber. And then Gabriel Landsbergis, who says Lithuania will not be granting asylum to those who are simply running from responsibility. Russians should stay and fight against Putin. So the potential problem here is that hostility in the sense of type A by representatives of people in Western democracies could be problematic. So, but the question is whether and when are representatives of Western democracies treating foreigners with hostility in the sense of A? So is it the case that they do? And that's not so clear. Can hostility against migrants be justified in the sense of B or C? Now, I think it's at this point important to mention the role of commerce, since, as you all know, in perpetual peace, commerce is the driver for perpetual peace. So I quote from Towards Perpetual Peace. that the authorization of a foreign newcomer does not extend beyond the conditions which make it possible to seek commerce with the old inhabitants. In this way, distant parts of the world can enter peaceably into relations with one another, which can eventually become publicly lawful and so finally bring the human race even closer to a cosmopolitan constitution. And if you believe in the interpretation of perpetual peace as peace through law, then commerce is here the driver for this. So I'd say if people have something to offer, and Kant, of course, referred to them offering goods, but nowadays it's their workforce mostly, there must also be a possibility to stay and get a perspective to move from passive to active citizenship. So it might not be enough not to violate migrants' negative rights, but they must also be given an opportunity to be full members of society. Now, how could that happen? And here it's very interesting what Kant says in the doctrine of virtue, so where attitudes become relevant to him. And he says there is a friend of humanity, so who finds satisfaction in the well-being of others, and of course his attitude is sympathy, benevolence, and he would be ready to fulfill the duty of beneficence. And then there is the enemy of humanity, so that's someone for whom it is well only when things go bad for others, and his attitude, of course, is malevolence or Schadenfreude. And there's a selfish person, someone who is indifferent to how things go for others if they go well for himself, and that person might be indifferent. So, but now when it comes to migration, maybe it's not even necessary to be a friend of humanity, so, and greet others with universal hospitality, but it might be enough to be selfish within the limits of respecting others as equal persons, and then that would mean to trade with them. That would, of course, be in the self-interest within certain limits, still respecting the other as a person, but it would not amount to the enemy of humanity, so who's only happy if others fail. And of course, the enemy of humanity might then, at a certain point, be irrational. So if the enemy of humanity, for example, doesn't want to exchange goods or to accept the offering of the workforce of someone who wants to enter the country peaceably, just because he wants to see them fail and doesn't like them. Okay, so let's sum up where the hostile attitude against others comes from, namely, as Kant writes in The Religion, and I already quoted that as the beginning. So it comes from so-called comparing self-love. And the effect of comparing self-love, so we always make comparisons with others, amounts to that we judge ourselves happy or unhappy only by comparison. This self-love creates the inclination to become worthy in the opinion of others, and this starts as a desire merely for equality, to allow no one to rise above oneself, which is good, but then combined with a constant anxiety about whether others are trying to do just that, from which there gradually arises the unjustifiable craving to achieve superiority for oneself over others. And now these great vices can be grafted onto the twin stem of jealousy and rivalry, namely the vices of secret and open hostility towards everyone we see as alien to us. And that's the vice of hostility, which can never be justified, just explained, so as he does here psychologically. So I think even that hostile attitudes that constitute types of vicious hostility in the sense of A can be twofold. So there's hostility of fear that results from an upward comparison with others. Others are seen as a threat to oneself, and the corresponding vices are malice, ingratitude, Schadenfreude, revenge, or hostility of contempt, which results from a downward comparison with others. So others are seen as of lesser value, and they should stay where they are. And I quote from the doctrine of virtue: arrogance is, as it were, a solicitation of the part of one seeking honor for followers whom he thinks he is entitled to treat with contempt. It is obvious that this is unjust and opposed to the respect owed to human beings as such. All right, let's come to the last part, the evaluation of the examples. So I think that Theresa May is creating a hostile environment for illegal immigrants expresses hostility of type A if they behave peacefully and are offering workforce. So that would be hostility of fear, xenophobia, and the expression here fits nicely into what Kant says in the religion, namely that it's a fear of all that is alien to us. So that would be a kind of hostility which is also then something that has traces of the enemy of humanity, so that wants others to be less well off, even if that is not better to yourself. So it's not even maybe an egoistic attitude, but a vicious attitude in the sense that it's based on or then framing others as if they were something you have to fear of, as if they were dangerous. And then framing people who want to come as dangerous is widespread, of course, in politics. So other examples would be Suella Braverman, who was talking of an invasion, or, of course, a lot of things that Donald Trump says all the time. Good, so now with Macron, it's a bit different because then here I think the problem is that he's accusing immigrants of selling drugs and call them to feel dignified as Uber drivers, so with 60 to 70 hours to meet the minimum wage. That can be a type of hostility in the sense of A, but it's then calls to the sociological knowledge that we have about immigrants' economic situation. Namely, they were not selling drugs. They already had 2 other jobs, but they couldn't make a living with them. And so they had to take this exploitative job on top. And here what is at work when Macron says, but you can be happy about that, that gives you like the best social dignity that you can get in this society, can be then subsumed under hostility of contempt, arrogance. And now we're almost ready for discussion, because I think the most thought-provoking example is Gabrielus Landsbergis, since you could say, and some reporters said that this is unjustified hostility since Russian citizens might be destroyed when they're being sent back to Russia, and this was the case at the time when they sought refuge in Lithuania, because that was at a point when it was clear that they were forced to go to Ukraine at the front, and that when they didn't make it out of the country, or when they were sent back, they were the first ones who were then admitted into a really dangerous situation. Secondly, some of them might be spies or saboteurs, which may justify hostility in the type of C, but you don't know if there are, and then to judge the individual by the group would not be ethically justifiable. And third, so there can be no cosmopolitan rule of law without people fighting for it, so that's what he says, so they should stay in Russia and fight against Putin. And that leads to the question which was also mentioned in other talks. So perpetual peace is peace through law. So in history, states should be republicanized at some point, but how will that be brought about? Then he doesn't have a right to resistance or to rebellion. We also discussed this today. And now there is a bit of a question mark here. So how we should judge that and what people should do. Okay, I come to the conclusion. Hostility is morally wrong when it's incompatible with treating others as ends in themselves. That seems clear. Hostility seems justified, but only with restrictions. From a Kantian perspective, it's wrong to create a hostile atmosphere against immigrants, but deportation is still allowed if persons won't be destroyed. It's unclear what the right answer to Landsbergis is, since here Kant's teleological assumptions come into play. Okay, I thank you very much for your attention and for your hopefully helpful comments.
Thank you very much, Mieth. I think now we have plenty of time for discussion, as it was the last paper. So, questions, please.
The situation. Thank you. I didn't. Thank you for your talk. I'm a little bit perplexed about two things. First is the alleged contradiction or disharmony between ethical and political sense of hostility. The situation you quoted from the Religionsschrift, this is basically a description of the genesis of competition between people that stems from Rousseau. And the basic difference is l'amour de soi, l'amour propre. And I don't think where in this respect there is a kind of contradiction between ethical and political level. Ethically, I am not sure whether Kant would say that hostility is ethically always wrong. I think the right to self-defense, which practices hostility against someone else, is justified. So I don't see the paradox. I would say that, as Corina developed earlier, there is quite a parallel between ethical and political level. And then the last thing is, the other perplexity is the treatment of those three cases, especially the third one. And I think that this, I don't know, let us change some descriptions. Let us say that we have, some fugitive that runs from totalitarian, politically despotic country. And I think that in all three questions could be raised with the same justification. So what you're, by questioning this case, I think that basically you question the right of asylum for basically anyone, because if it is an unjust country where justice doesn't prevail, and I think that we have a moral duty to do that, then in every case, if every single case, I would say, you could send them back claiming, what are you doing here? Why don't you strive for the justice in your country?
Thank you so much. So I like the last point because I think you're right. But I'm not so sure whether you can then really derive this right of asylum from Kant. So, I mean, people try it because he has this passage. So you can only send back people if this can be done without their destruction. So would you want to refer to that? Yeah. So
he might be, or she might be a spy. What kind of argument? What kind of argument is that?
That's the argument that Lithuania might be threatened by people coming in.
But spies come from, let's say, spies come from United States. Spies come from Libya, Iran. Spies come from Slovenia or Germany. Germany has spies as well. And you never know what German might prove to be a spy. So by raising this question, well, I don't see the point, really. But the most important is, I would say, the third one. So does one have the duty to fight for justice where he or she ran while it proved to be dangerous? Yes, this is the usual situation, too dangerous. And if you say, yes, but you have to fight for justice because if you run away, if you don't stand up, then the bad things are going to prevail, so we'll send you back.
I mean, the interesting thing is, so my personal opinion is that Landsbergis doesn't have the moral standing to judge, so whether people should stay and fight or not. So that's their own decision. And then you're right, so I think also how this is handled in Germany, the right of asylum might apply, at least so that they're given what we call secondary protection. But I think it's interesting question for Kant, because then he just needs at some point this teleology of history, or this role of commerce, something that gives us hope, let's say, that the situation will be brought about sooner or later, so where all the states republicanized, and you don't have to confront that kind of problem. And that's just a question mark how we should deal with things as long as that's not the case. And then, yes, so I like your first remark, that there is no difference between the ethical and legal political framing of hostility. But I'd say somehow there is, because then he refers to hostility in ethical sense as a vice, and he ascribes to the enemy of humanity, so who is only good if others are bad, and who is schadenfroh, a vicious attitude towards others. And I find that very interesting, because that can never be justified, but would in some way then go over what the conceptualization of others as enemies in a legal sense means, if they're not framed as falling under enemy combat law or mere enemies, so that no law applies to them. And insofar, there might be a parallel, because then the one who's vicious is not acting in self-defense, but has the general attitude that he's better when others fail, or that he wants to make others fail, even if that happens at the expense of his self-interest. And that I find very interesting in that context of like how, when it comes to migration into Western countries today, immigrants are framed as threats or as dangerous, although they might be useful members of societies and shouldn't be exploited as mere means, but be given the opportunity to, like, as I quoted, offer themselves and their workforce to society and interaction. And so sometimes it might happen that people who refuse that are not even self-interested, but straightforward vicious, in the sense that their framing and their actions are determined by the wish that they fail.
So I'm glad both that you went that direction about migration and work, and also to the Rousseau reference. And Rousseau, in the second discourse, he has a very, very good analysis about how amour de soi and comparison work towards some sorts of social pathologies. But in the first discourse, he has this passage where he says that some modern societies and states tend to treat their citizens, to value them insofar as they contribute to the country's economy. And in some countries, the value of a human life is less than zero because maybe too many people and so on and so forth. And this makes me think about your distinction between instrumentalization and being treated as an obstacle. So this might be a maybe nitpicking, but can we think about being treated as an obstacle as like a negative instrument? So you need a certain sort of instrument, you have demand for that, but then you have oversupply, and then the same instrument becomes an obstacle. And so if you treat humans like that, that would be a problem that kind of unites those two issues of hostile treatment. And then going to a short circuit with Marx, which I find is a very relevant analysis to the situation with Macron and maybe Theresa May and contemporary labor situation with migrants. So at some point in the Capital, he had some reflections about the treatment of Irish workers in England and how the capitalists profit from instilling hostile attitudes within the English workers towards the Irish. So worker solidarity becomes feebler, but also wages fall because there is an influx of Irish migrants. So this might be the case in a more contemporary European context on the one hand, and also it makes us think about another political dimension, because it seems to be different if we're talking about hostility that I might have as a worker mechanic, and maybe the Polish plumber will take my job, so that's the British situation. And if I'm a British politician and tries to send some hostile messages to the public. So I think this is...
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a very complex topic. And one question is, so what's the difference between seeing someone as competition and seeing someone as an enemy? Because, I mean, there might be legitimate competition, and that might even be a driver, so for society's prosperity. But then framing others as enemies might be problematic, and for once, if it's not empirically adequate, so if you're speaking of an invasion where actually there is no invasion in a military sense and no one wants to take over your country, but people just want to interact and to get some jobs, so that would be a wrong framing. And then there might be an inner attitude, so which leads to be hostile towards everyone who's alien to us, which might be simply irrational, in the sense that this attitude might then make it impossible to interact with those others in a way that would be good for self-interest. Yeah. And then there, of course, so I made it very short here, but one can discuss if the politicians like Theresa May or Trump make such statements, it could be that they instrumentalize those who want to come in order to gain votes, so that they don't really think that we have to fear an invasion or whatever, but they just say it in order to provoke some fear in the public and so to gain some votes. That could also be the case. But I think a very interesting question, so within Kantian cosmopolitanism, is so whether people are coming in peace or not, because then I think it's relatively clear that if not, it's legitimate to be hostile towards them, although not all the way down, but within certain limits. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Corina, for your fascinating paper. So I have one remark, just so to say that Svarko actually has a perspective which is very very close to Fichte. I just wanted to quote how Fichte comments the first definitive article in his review. He says, das Recht jedes Menschen seiner bloßen Ankunftswillen auf dem Boden eines anderen Staats nicht feindselig behandelt zu werden. Und dann heißt, wozu nach den Grundsätzen des bloßen Staatsrechts der Staat allerdings das vollkommenste Recht hätte. So for Fichte, it's legitimate to treat the foreigner as hostile, so in the view of the right of the state. But so coming to your paper, actually I really appreciate it, but I'm not sure. So you distinguish between the legal meaning of the duty not to treat with hostility and the ethical dimension, but I'm not sure that and you try to verify if hostility in a legal and juridical dimension is conciliable with the ethical meaning. But as I see the cosmopolitan right, actually cosmopolitan Kant begins the first definitive article by stating that it's not philanthropy. So he is very clear on the fact that cosmopolitan right is right, and the duty not to treat with hostility is not an ethical duty, but a legal duty. What for me is the force of this argument, because this means that it's a perfect duty, and then it comes with the problem of enforcement of this duty not to treat with hostility. And in my view, this means that it is a thin duty. The state has only the duty not to allow the foreigner to come to offer himself to society. Then this means that if a state doesn't allow it because it emanates a restrictive law against immigration, the immigrant who wants to come in is allowed to enter the state, because it's a form of right, as I see it. So it's a way of enforcement which doesn't come from supranational institutions, but from the people who are deprived of a perfect right. How do you see the thing?
I find that very interesting. But what do you make then of the passage where Kant says, so he can be sent away if that can be done without his destruction? Because then what you say would only apply to people who cannot be sent back without being destroyed.
No, I mean, so the problem is very thin. So it's this right is very thin. So I have to be allowed to come in to make my proposal. It's not legitimate to emanate a law which restricts immigrations without allowing people to come in.
Yes, I mean, I like the idea. I like the idea. And I try to approach it a little bit more indirect. So from the attitudes that might be widespread in the receiving society, so that it might not even be in your best self-interest to possess the vice of hostility against those who are alien to you, because that might you worse off than if you're not hostile and ready to exchange. So that was the kind of indirect way that I approach this. And so what you're proposing is that others have a right to offer themselves to society. And yeah, here I'm not sure, because what does it mean to offer yourself? I mean, then you come and say, I have to offer ABC, and then if people say, but I don't want to take your offer, I don't want to buy A, and I don't want to take your offer to work for me B, and I don't want C, what else you have to offer, then you made your offer, but then that was it. And I think we don't get anything more than that from Kant. So we can get as far as that, and then we can add what I said, so people should be open-minded, because it might be a good offer, and they might be better off, so in terms of self-interest, with taking this offer and going into exchange than sticking to their vicious xenophobic attitudes. But then at some point, if the offer isn't good, then there would come a turning point. And then there would stick in all this system that a lot of people have defended, also interpreting Kant, then it would become a question of beneficence. And that's something different. So then you have to be beneficent because someone doesn't have anything to offer, but they're still needy, and then you're beneficent. But I think it's very important so that the first approach to a lot of people who want to come and want to offer something is not that of beneficence, but that of respect, and let them do that. So I think we're on the same page here.
More questions? So if there are no more questions, thank you so much. We had a very interesting day and couldn't wish for more, just for dinner.